We do have the suspect. Suspect is not on me.
All right, stay back. There's liable to be another one.
Police say they knew something was going to happen today because they began getting calls last night. So they placed extra men in the downtown area.
The last time we were together in this series, I discussed the strange history of the Lonsdale Square restroom in downtown Portland. In this installment, where should I go next? How about right across the street? From 1909 until 1967, this was the site of what one might call a typical hotel of the time, a 2-story brick structure with an entrance along Salmon Street, just east of 4th Avenue, and business spaces on the ground floor. It went by the name of the Reed Hotel. Rarely mentioned in old newspapers and other forms of documentation, it's very possible I never would have known the Reed Hotel existed. I discovered it back in 2017 on the Slabtown Chronicle blog, written by the late, great local historian J.D. Chandler. A 2015 piece he wrote titled Murder Hotel captured my attention and delved into the most controversial period of the hotel's existence, from the 1920s into the 1940s. Oddly, there was little to no information available on the hotel's last 20 years of existence. This led me to wonder if it possibly went under a different name during those later years. And in my earlier YouTubing years, I did a short video about this place, with probably the most interesting part being, well, this guy. Yeah. For years, I couldn't find a picture showing this location during those years, which astonished me considering the prominence of the area where this hotel was located. Then, I finally found this image on Vintage Portland's picture blog. Taken in 1966, showing the intersection of 3rd and Salmon. To the far left end of the picture, we see a 2-story brick building. This is the Reed. I later found this 1949 overview image of Lonsdale Square, which shows a view of the Reed towards the right end of the photograph. Apparently, it had modern rooms. It was also in this picture that I noticed a seemingly unnecessary open space in the middle portion of the building, perhaps put there simply because they couldn't put anything else there. But being such a tight-fitted area, cut-off space with bland windows facing other bland windows, my imagination runs wild with what kind of vice may have occurred in this area and what kind of evidence may have been hidden or discarded there. After finding these 2 images, without even looking, I kept finding the Reed in the background of other pictures, sometimes barely discernible, but absolutely there. Such makes so much sense, considering what the place was like. It was bland and unassuming. It almost didn't deserve a photograph of its own. It always just hid in the background. And yet, in a city full of nondescript hotels with questionable histories within their walls, the Reed was just a cut above the others, such as the Byron, where Edwin Sid Ghirardelli of the Ghirardelli chocolate family took his own life in 1912 after being sent away by his family for being gay. And, of course, many hotels on Skid Row were known for everything from gambling to prostitution to being headquarters for small criminal syndicates. And in later years, many of these places were transformed into shabby housing for the city's transient population. I'm not sure if the Reed became like these others, especially since it was closed down during the 60s, but I get the feeling it functioned much like those others in its final years. And much like in its later years, there's not a lot of information known about the first 9 or so years of the hotel's existence, other than an obvious renovation and revival done in 1915. Built in the heart of the lesser-known southwest Portland Skid Row area, known for rampant crime and violence, the Reed would end up fitting in quite well. While it didn't develop much of a crooked reputation until the 20s, crime there dated back at least as far as 1918. An investigation into police grafting led to a raid being done on the hotel that year, and in the arrest of several women, many of whom were assumed to be prostitutes. But these women were later released when the proprietress denied knowing why they were there. The page showing who had checked in during that time was also mysteriously torn out of the hotel's ledger. At this time, the Multnomah County District Attorney, Walter Evans, sought to just have the hotel shut down, but that obviously didn't happen. During this time, the hotel was run by a W.J. McClune, whose worst crime, as far as I could find, was getting busted for illegally burning trash inside the hotel. Small potatoes compared to what was to come. So, you know how in the movie John Wick there's this hotel that he goes to where criminals and the like are protected from the outside world? Well, that's kinda what the Reed Hotel became. Control of the place fell into the hands of Jean Miller, a woman from a prominent Portland family who had fallen from grace and into a heroin addiction. She had an extensive criminal record, including narcotics and immorality charges, and thus it made sense that she'd have both numerous criminal connections as well as a desire to harbor criminals. Helping in her efforts were John Lowe, a local bootlegger, and an attorney by the name of Isidore Anklis. We'll be getting back to Anklis later. The Reed was to become a haven of bootleggers and burglars, along with various transients, sex workers, and alcoholics. Perhaps more than anything else, the Reed Hotel was a brutal representation of the struggles women faced in the earlier days of Portland. Prior to the 1900s, Portland was known as a man's town, but in the early years of the 20th century, the city saw a rush of women flock to town, living under a plethora of different circumstances. The ones who struggled the most found themselves living in squalor and generally forgotten by their fellow citizens. With the Reed being built during this spike, it would inevitably become a home to many of these lost women. In J.D. Chandler's written piece on the hotel, he noted at least 2 known instances of women leaping from their second-floor rooms, sustaining injuries, in order to escape men who had lured them there. A strong metaphor for the kind of place this was. A world of not only blue-collar criminals, but also predators. Ethel Jane Rice, buried somewhere in this grassy patch at Portland's Greenwood Hill Cemetery, ended up in Portland under the throes of alcoholism. Separated from her husband years earlier and having a child potentially out of wedlock that she put up for adoption, Ethel met James Rice in Seattle and married him. But a once content housewife had become so overcome by drink that James brought her to Portland for help in September of 1947. Instead, Ethel vanished into the night and went missing. Nobody realized that she'd checked in to the shabby Reed Hotel. And when she wasn't there, she was being picked up by random men and taken to their hotel rooms, likely being paid with money she then used to buy booze. On September 19th, while approaching the Reed, she encountered a stumbling drunk ex-con named Rutherford Beer. He asked if she was there for him, and she said yes. The two went to Beer's room inside the hotel, and a short while later he left the hotel, alone. Visiting several bars and getting more drunk, he later returned to his room to make a grisly discovery. Ethel Rice, dead on his bed. He dizzily called the police and claimed confusion. He would tell them he caught Ethel trying to steal his wallet, and he just smacked her around a few times before he stormed out to drink more, coming back and finding her dead. An analysis of Ethel's body told a different story. She had been strangled to death while sustaining a skull fracture. The official cause of death was that skull fracture, bringing on cerebral hemorrhage. The ex-con Beer would end up serving 10 years for what must have been a brutal killing, dying in a car accident himself shortly after his release. Ethel was just one of many, but one who experienced the worst of what the Reed had to offer. More than a decade later, another murder would be tied to the Reed, granted from a distance. On July 26, 1936, 49-year-old Ada Haskins was found dead in Portland's Washington Park, strangled with a piece of baling wire. It's believed she was killed the night before, and she had been living at the Reed at the time. Authorities considered the possibility that Haskins, financially broke and depressed, may have taken her own life. Her husband, Roy, had committed suicide himself only months earlier. But Ada's sister, Ava, disputed this claim, noting that Ada had been in good spirits and that she was planning on throwing a party soon. Ultimately, there became little doubt, at least to most, that this was a murder. The one thing in doubt was who was responsible. The night before she was found dead, another tenant at the Reed heard her discussing money matters with an unknown man in her room. Her room was also found locked, but her key was never found, suggesting her killer may have locked her door to keep curious parties out. She was witnessed that night getting into a car with another man. Shortly before her body was found, 2 boys in Washington Park reported seeing 2 men rushing down a trail, apparently fleeing the area. Ultimately, 2 men, also staying at the Reed, William Ray and Faye B. Wise, would come under suspicion and be grilled for hours on the matter. Ray and Wise were those classic lifelong criminals, the types to hold up a bank the day they were released from prison. Wise did time for robbing a roadhouse in 1926, and after his release in 1930, quickly went back to prison on a burglary charge. Not only were Ray and Wise also residing at the Reed, but Ray had recently loaned Ada $200. 2 IOUs were found in Ada's room, one of which was due to be paid on July 25th, the day she was presumed to be killed. It was theorized that Ray, accompanied by Wise, went to collect, but Ada did not have the money and ultimately suffered the consequences. Despite grilling for 3 days, the 2 men wouldn't break, and the police let them go. Conveniently, authorities went back to the suicide angle after this. But what are the odds that a woman would end up dead at the same time she owed a criminal money? I tried to find Ada's grave at the Multnomah Park Cemetery in southeast Portland, but was unsuccessful. Many graves there have been reclaimed by nature. I'm fairly convinced at least one of these men, more likely Ray under the circumstances, was responsible for Ada Haskins' murder. Again, the Reed was a place that protected its criminals, sometimes to the point of influencing local police. Is it possible they were protecting William Ray and Faye Wise? Unless you want to believe a woman, preparing to throw a party, on the day she owed a criminal money, wandered a few miles into Washington Park and killed herself in an unnecessarily painful and rare manner, as opposed to death by gunshot or poisoning, then it was a murder. Either way, many women came and many women suffered when they stayed at the Reed Hotel. As mentioned before, attorney Isidore Ankelis was critical in the protection of criminals at the Reed, while having a sketchy reputation for defending bootleggers and the like. Ankelis was also a member of the Ex-Newsboys organization, a fraternity of sorts consisting of local men who were paperboys as kids. This organization had a surprisingly successful collection of members, including future mayors George Baker and Terry Shrunk, Portland's two longest-serving mayors. By 1934, it had appeared that Ankelis' days of corruption were over when he was disbarred on a forgery charge, but he would later be reinstated on a probationary status. A slap on the wrist, allowing him to get back to his dirty deeds. However, just a couple years later, the bottom truly fell out. In the summer of 1938, it was discovered that Ankelis was the brains behind a kidnap syndicate. Both he and hotel proprietress Jane Miller would be arrested in relation to this. They had sent two goons, Anthony Gargulio and Lee W. Tomlinson, out to apprehend Thomas Lowe, a well-to-do farmer from Idaho. These two men posed as federal agents and abducted him, keeping him hostage until Lowe agreed to pay almost $1,000 for his release. Gargulio and Tomlinson were staying at the Reed regularly during this time, leading to Gene Miller's charge specifically being harboring fugitives wanted for kidnapping. Ankelis would be found guilty on his charge and received a sentence of a year and a day. Fairly charitable for a crooked lawyer connected to a federal crime. Miller would also be convicted, only to have that conviction voided before being retried and, again, found guilty for her involvement. She was able to pay a fee of $500 to avoid jail time. At least, that's what it said she did. I'm not sure what effect this had on her running of the Reed, or how much longer she was in control of it. Ankelis ultimately relocated to Los Angeles, where, according to a 1950 article, he still couldn't keep himself out of trouble. It also said that, by this time, he was running a cigar store. Something tells me being on probation and running a kidnap syndicate was the final nail in his coffin in terms of work as a practicing attorney. He would pass away in 1967. Strangely enough, the same year that the Reed closed down. Clearly, with cases like the brutal murder of Ethel Jane Rice in 1947, the Reed did not turn a corner by the end of the 30s. But as far as its final years, leading up to its 1967 closure, the Reed story is a mystery. I haven't uncovered any more serious crimes that occurred there during its final years, and I'm led to believe it was just another slowly dying, cheap spot for alcoholics, transients, and folks that were just generally down on their luck to crash at. It beats sleeping on the streets. Looking at the building, I also wonder what businesses existed on the ground floor level. I would predict at least one bar was there once upon a time, or even a pawn shop or two, considering the area. The 1949 picture of the area clearly indicates that an antique shop was located in one of these store spaces, at least at that time. And while it's blurry, it appears to me that in the 1966 picture that there was a thrift shop located there. I also found that a gay bar known as the Little Brown Jug was located at a spot that may have been the westernmost space of the Reed. However, it did have a 4th Avenue address, and the Reed building faced Salmon Street, so this bar may have just been behind that building. Regardless, there were several gay bars within a block of the Reed at various times, along with the Lonsdale Square restroom right across the street, another site known for what were called clandestine gay encounters back then. While I haven't found any info to back it, I wonder, particularly in its later years, the 50s and 60s, if the Reed became another place for gay men to rendezvous under concealed circumstances.
Alright, so here's the thing, is, nowadays, most of us know not to just share our personal information, our address, our phone number, all that stuff. Well, back in the day, that wasn't considered much of a problem, again, probably because social media and things like that didn't exist to show us a lot more about the crazy people out there. But that was one of the things I loved, is a lot of newspapers up into the 1930s, they always gave you, if they had the address to someplace, they gave it to you. So you knew exactly where an event happened, you knew where the people involved lived. Heck, if there was like a crime happened and a witness was nearby, they would give you the home address of that witness. So for whatever reason, if I wanted to look back at a witness, I could literally know exactly where they lived. Now, again, kind of in the 1930s and going into the 1940s, newspaper articles, again, that's, primary resource for me in a lot of my videos, they started becoming a little bit more vague in terms of where events happen. You started not seeing addresses as often. You even stopped seeing names. So if something happened at, say, a hotel, a lot of times they would just say like, oh, such and such happened at a downtown Portland hotel, or even just a Portland hotel. So a lot of times you didn't have the name of the hotel, you didn't have the address. You didn't even have a particular part of town that it was in. Like if it's in downtown, okay, what part of downtown? Down by where PSU is today, Chinatown, the waterfront, the Alphabet District, all the fringe of downtown. I think that's definitely the biggest roadblock in a story such as this one, is once you get into the 30s and beyond, that information that you kind of need starts becoming less and less common, and things can happen, but you don't know exactly where they're happening at. And so, in the case of the Reed Hotel, really, the latest story I found is 1948, the Ethel Jane Rice case, and that's simply because it was in J.D. Chandler's written piece on it. But the hotel was open for another 20 years, almost, after Jane Rice was killed. And for that period of time, I literally didn't find one single story in relation to that hotel, at least one that I could positively tie to the Reed.
There really may be a lot more lost and forgotten history to this place than we realize. And then again, we may know all of its most intriguing points. But, for a time, this unremarkable little hole in the wall was one of the scariest, most corrupt and violent places in town. And that is, if not totally complete, the history of the Reed Hotel, demolished back in the late 1960s. And as is often the case, once I reach the conclusion of one video in this series, I start wondering, what should I cover next? What should I cover next.